Thank you very much, Mo. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to be discussing the journey through secondary school. So now we have a good understanding of what neurodiversity is, and we understand that it's a concept where neurological differences are respected and recognized just like any other human variation. In other words, put in very simple terms, we are all wired differently, and we need to respect that. We also have an understanding that neurodiversity is an umbrella term for a whole host of conditions. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on conditions that have a more direct impact on learning. And I'm not saying that things like mental health issues or gender issues don't impact on learning, but perhaps their impact is less direct. So for the purposes of this evening, I'm going to be talking about conditions such as dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, autistic spectrum disorder, sensory processing difficulties, and such like. And what we're going to have a look at is how does this impact on the young person going to secondary school, and what are the implications for secondary school of the neurodiverse pupil. Ideally, what we are looking for is what Mo referred to as the inclusive classroom. I have called it a strength-based classroom, and that is a place where young people with all kinds of different thinking, learning styles can meet and feel safe as part of a new learning environment. So that's what we're aiming for. I'm going to now we're going to now have a look at the differences between primary and secondary school. I've had the privilege of working in both. I've spent many years in primary school, and latterly I spent my last 6 years working in a secondary school. So I feel that I have quite a good understanding of both of them, and I would like to just highlight some of the differences. And we're going to have a look at this through Sammy's journey. Sammy is somebody who's finished primary school and is transitioning up to secondary school. Sammy's had a fairly positive primary school experience, despite having some difficulties, such as literacy difficulties, which he was identified with dyslexia in P5, and he still presents with some numeracy and processing difficulties. In terms of awareness of needs, in primary school, Sammy has one teacher each day, every day for the whole year. It's really easy for that teacher to get to know and get an idea of Sammy's profile of learning, what his needs are, what his areas of strength are. Contrary to this is in secondary, where Sammy will be exposed to possibly 14 teachers in a week. Some teachers will only see him for 1 or 2 periods, depending on what subjects they take. And therefore, it's a lot more difficult for these teachers to get to know Sammy and get to know his strengths, his areas of need, and what his learning profile is like. The teacher needs to absolutely put in a lot of effort to get to know Sammy and what these are, or what his needs are. I'd like to reassure parents at this point that there is a very effective and efficient way of transferring information from primary school to secondary school. All secondary schools have got a very efficient system in place, and it's usually done face-to-face, apart from during COVID, but it's meetings that take place where information is passed on to the secondary school. This information is stored electronically and is available and accessible to all teachers in secondary school. So I sometimes hear parents say, oh, but this teacher doesn't understand or doesn't know that Sammy finds this difficult. Yes, there will be some teachers that don't, or maybe perhaps haven't realized that. And then I say to parents that it's their responsibility to make sure that they communicate that to the secondary school. And the main form of communication in secondary school, unlike primary school, where there's an open door policy and you can speak to classroom teachers before and after school most days, secondary school is not like that. The main form of communication in secondary school is via the guidance teacher. And I cannot stress this enough. If you have a young person with neurodiverse needs, develop a relationship with your pupil's guidance teacher, and make sure that you have a channel of communication that's open, and just email and phone any concerns or queries that you have, and they will pass that on to the subject teachers. It's their responsibility. Talking about support, In primary school, most young people access small group support if they have literacy or numeracy or communication difficulties. That's very often a common form of supporting youngsters in primary school. In secondary school, we don't really have the luxury of small group support or one-to-one. This is because the curriculum is really tight and there just isn't time. And if you remove pupils out of a period of learning, it's very difficult for them to catch up. The second reason why it's very difficult to access small group support in secondary school is because we have something called stigma attached to accessing support. Youngsters in secondary school find it difficult to be different to anybody else. They want to blend in. They don't want to stand out in any way. Peer pressure is also a huge factor. So accessing support in secondary school is a little bit different. We do have support available in classrooms, and many young people access that support in the classroom, but it's different to small group and one-to-one individual attention, input. Sadly, in secondary school, we don't have the benefit of boosting self-esteem through small group support and one-to-one, because very often the byproduct of a small group support input is self-esteem. The youngster's self-esteem is boosted, they go back to the classroom feeling good about themselves and their learning. We have to find other ways in secondary to boost their self-esteem. Just going back to the curriculum in secondary school, I have a friend who has a son in first year at the moment, first year of secondary school. And he came home one day and he just said, school's rubbish. It's just not fair. He said, there are just so many subjects and they all just English in disguise. And I thought that was a really good way of describing some subjects. They're exposed to so many new subjects with so much new vocabulary. And very often this can result in them becoming lost in their learning. We talk about youngsters who become lost, and very often it's because of the curriculum and them not being able to keep up. We're now going to have a look at an animated image that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It represents an assessment which requires 6 animals to climb a tree. It's very obvious that when you look at that image, there's only one animal that has the ability to climb the tree. Perhaps this is representative of our secondary schools. We are requiring all our pupils to follow the same curriculum and sit the same assessment. It's our job as parents and teachers to help them to make this all more accessible for them. I'd like to have a look at this in connection with Albert Einstein's quote. It's often associated with that animation. And Albert Einstein said, everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it's stupid. We need to make sure that we avoid that for young people in secondary. So what can we do as teachers and as parents? But I'm going to talk first of all mainly to do with teachers. Survey evidence from the Manchester University carried out with pupils with dyslexia indicates that a crucial, possibly overriding factor associated with academic success is what has been described as the emotional climate of the classroom. And I feel passionately about this because it's how classroom teaching is organized and experienced that can have a great impact on how well a young person succeeds. It can have an impact on how a young person thinks, feels about themselves and their capacity to learn, and ultimately how they see themselves as learners. Critically, what learners with dyslexia require is, and we've included this in one of our Dyslexia Scotland publications, is empathic and effective classroom teachers. That is what pupils with dyslexia have highlighted as what they need. This all builds up a picture that suggests that enhancing the achievements of pupils with dyslexia doesn't make demands on any primary or secondary school teachers in terms of interventions or programs or anything, but rather it is the way that teachers go about teaching and organizing their classroom that is either facilitating or frustrating for young people. This applies to pupils with dyslexia, but of course it actually applies to any young person, even those without neurodiverse needs. The key comes in understanding how each pupil thinks, feels, and learns. And again, this applies to every single learner in the classroom. And I'm just going to read through this quotation because I feel that it's really, really important. Overall, it is clear that these pupils have no difficulty recognizing the learning environment in which they can succeed. It is interesting that the underlying theme is the emotional climate in the classroom, rather than any specific techniques or special methodology. They want calmness and security, the feeling that teachers actually like them and are enthusiastic about their subject. Quiet recognition of their differences and the provision of two key structures, differentiation and support. We felt so strongly about this quotation that it's been included in the SBC dyslexia and literacy policy, and I feel it underpins everything about teaching and learning pupils and young people with neurodiverse needs. I'm going to now have a look at another image, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, but I think it's worth revisiting in the context of young people with neurodiverse needs. The iceberg captures the idea that what we see on the surface is underpinned by a whole hidden depth underneath. All our learners are icebergs, but the part of their characters that we see is very often only a tiny, small part of it. There's a lot that's going on underneath that we don't see. So I'm going to highlight three different scenarios very quickly. So this is particularly true of pupils with learning differences. Sometimes their challenges are so overwhelming that they mask their learning strengths. We can't see their learning strengths. We don't know what they are. And very often as teachers, we think, do they have any strengths? And as parents, sometimes you might think, what are their strengths? They will have a host of strengths, but very often they don't come to the surface and we don't know what they are. This is a problem because we need young people's strengths in order to support their needs. We cannot help them with their needs if we don't know what their strengths are. The second case that I'd like to highlight is where learners conceal their challenges by putting into place a range of compensatory strategies or coping mechanisms. In this case, the learner may seem as if they're coping on the surface, but actually below the surface, they're really struggling to keep up. It's our job as parents and teachers to dig down below that surface and find out as much as we can about what they're putting in place in order to cope. It's not uncommon for young people to arrive in secondary school with unidentified literacy difficulties, or even in some cases, dyslexia. This is because the young person in primary has managed to put coping mechanisms and strategies in place to mask their difficulties. They manage to get through primary school, but when they get to secondary school, the jump becomes too great. The quality of work, the quantity of work, the time involved doesn't allow them to use those strategies, and that is when the difficulties are highlighted. The third case that I'd like to highlight came to light when I was working in a secondary school, assessing and identifying pupils with literacy difficulties. Many youngsters in their final years of secondary school, so I'm talking about 4th, 5th, and 6th year, would come and self-refer to me and say, I think I have a difficulty with literacy. And I'd say, why do you think that? And they'd say, because I'm putting in so much work and so much effort, but I'm not seeing the results. And although they were doing reasonably well, they felt they weren't reaching their potential. After undergoing assessment and screenings and the whole assessment process, it very often became clear that they did have specific literacy difficulties. And when I shared that with their subject teachers, the subject teachers often shocked and would say, but she's doing so well, or he's in my top set, or he always produces a good piece of work. And I'd say, yes, but you have no idea how much effort and work has gone into that. Imagine if we put strategies in place and appropriate assessment arrangements in place, how much better they could do. That is why it's really important to see the whole picture. This brings me to comorbidity, which I'm just going to touch on because I know Alison in her next presentation is going to talk about this. Comorbidity is the co-occurrence of many conditions at the same time. It can be also termed co-occurrence, but for the purpose of this, I'm just going to talk about comorbidity. I've highlighted 7 different conditions on the screen. I'm not going to go into them at all, but what I'd like to focus on is the central red bit on the screen, which highlights and has spoken about all the difficulties that are common to all those conditions. So we support any of those difficulties, and I'm just going to quickly run through them. We support any of those. We are supporting a huge range of neurodiverse needs in the classroom. So limited attention, poor organization skills, short working, poor working memory, no time management, limited listening skills, limited sensory perception, and slow speed of processing. So those are just some difficulties that overlap from all those conditions that are highlighted on that screen. If we manage and support those difficulties, we're supporting a whole host of conditions. Underpinning all of those difficulties, highlighted in the bottom in capital letters, is self-esteem. And that is something that we really, really need to be able to nurture, enhance, and boost in secondary school. It's the key factor that underpins all difficulties in secondary school. Sadly, by the time young people reach secondary school, although they might have had a reasonably positive experience, just if they are not coping in secondary school and they're finding the learning environment difficult, their self-esteem starts to spiral out of control in a downwards way. And we have to make sure as teachers and parents that we don't allow this to happen. We have to put measures in place that boosts, enhances, and helps this self-esteem to grow. How do we do this? We have to make sure that young people experience success. And as a parent, we can do this so easily. If we know what our young people's strengths are, what their talents are, what their interests are, we need to provide opportunities so that they can experience success doing these things. So we're not only talking about academic success, we're talking about success in any area. If they're good at rugby, playing an instrument, on the stage, whatever it is, play to their strengths, allow them to achieve in their areas of interest and talent. Praise them. I'm not talking about empty praise, but just where it's deserved. Make them feel valued and worthwhile. And I talk about something that's called reflective listening. If we put reflective listening in place, we make sure that the youngster knows that we value what they have to say. We're making sure that the young person feels valued and the contribution of what they're making verbally is valued and important. We need to have high expectation, but set realistic targets in order for them to achieve. Very, very important. I'm going to touch on something called differentiation. You will remember in the slide that with the quotation, young people mentioned that 2 things were key to them: support and differentiation. And I'm going to have a quick look at differentiation. Differentiation has often been misconstrued, and there's a very old-fashioned, I'd say, misconception of what differentiation is. Some of you might have experienced being put in a group in class in school, or you might have a child who's been put in a group in school where he's on a particular book or working at a particular level with a particular group of youngsters. This is an old-fashioned form of differentiation. There are so many things that a teacher can do, tiny little things that can make a difference to the young person and their learning. And these are differentiating in tiny ways. You can differentiate by providing appropriate seating for a young person. You can seat them next to a group of young people who find similar things difficult. Or, as Mo spoke about, you can use peers to mentor. You can seat them next to somebody who would be a good role model and a good mentor. Marking, finding something positive in that youngster's piece of work and saying something positive can give them a real boost. Verbal feedback, exactly the same, giving them a thumbs up, a smile, well done, I'm so pleased you listened to what I said yesterday, I can see that in your piece of work, will mean so much to them. Classroom displays, having things on the table and on the walls so that young people don't have to ask for something they don't know. They don't want to stand out in secondary school, so it's the worst thing you can ask them to do. Scaffolding, Mo touched on this. Scaffolding is about breaking a task down into small bits, providing examples of a successful piece of work so they can see what that looks like before they attempt their own. Giving a pupil, a young person, a blank piece of paper and asking them to do something is the worst thing you can do. Give them a choice of task. Be aware of different styles of learning. So often auditory, version of the task, or a visual version of the task, or a kinesthetic version of the task. Questioning, we can be very skillful in our questioning, and that can be a form of differentiation. And we can use learners to lead learning, or even to teach others, and we can differentiate through time, providing a longer period of time for young people who perhaps need that. And there's the traditional group work. There are some other ways and strategies that we as teachers and parents can use to support young people. We can keep language simple. We can keep instructions to a minimum. I'm sure many of you have been faced with the scenario where you say, go upstairs, put your laptop away, can you find your shoes for tomorrow, and bring down your lunchbox so that I can get it ready for tomorrow. The young person will come back with either none of them done or only one of them. So we need to make sure that we keep instructions to a minimum, reduce and support memory load, provide an example using scaffolding, encourage technology where appropriate, allow them alternatives to handwriting if that's what we need to do. And this is something I'd just like to talk about, metacognition. It's come to light for us as teachers that metacognition is hugely important when youngsters learn. They need to understand the mechanisms of how they learn. They need to learn about learning, and they need to have an awareness of how they learn. This research has proven to be the most impactful, cost-effective intervention of all. And teachers, if we understand this, we need to include this in our teaching, because it could be hugely, may have a huge impact. And the next two, I'd like to draw attention to for parents in particular. We often assume that young people have good organization skills, or they know how to organize their life, their work, everything. Or we assume that they know how to study. They don't. We need to teach them the skills. And again, I'd like to reassure parents that this is taught in secondary school in a subject called Learner Journey. But as parents, we can support this by putting things in place at home as well. And finally, motivation, hugely important in a positive way to support all of this. I'm going to touch on behavior, because all I want to highlight here is that all behavior, positive and negative, is a form of communication. And when young people go up to secondary school and their behavior changes in some way, this is a warning sign to us that something is going on. And very often it's telling us they're not coping with their learning. There are two scenarios here. They might withdraw and become very quiet and not communicate at home or in class, or they might become very active and challenging. The behavior becomes challenging, and they'd rather become known as the class clown than as the young people in the class who doesn't understand something. So I think we just need to be aware of that all behavior is a form of communication. We celebrate neurodiversity in secondary school really well. We celebrate individual conditions when they come up during the year. We celebrate Neurodiversity Week. We make sure that neurodiversity is part of the school priorities. We include parents and pupils celebrating their neurodiverse achievements. We make sure that we have neurodiverse ambassadors. I know at Elston High School they have dyslexia ambassadors. So we include the voice to make sure that a whole range of neurodiverse needs are celebrated. Assessment arrangements, I'm going to do a quick run through, very important in secondary school. And assessment arrangements are intended to enable candidates to demonstrate their attainment, not to compensate for the lack of it. So I think that's very, very important. Also, contrary to perception, young people do not have to have an identification or a diagnosis to access any of the assessment arrangements listed there. You can access an ICT with or without spell check, dependent on their spelling difficulties. You can access a prompt if a young person has difficulties with attention, a reader or a scribe or both. Someone can access rest breaks if they have a medical condition or they have difficulties with concentration, transcription whereby a young person can write their whole assessment, but it's really difficult to read. They can sit with an adult after the assessment and have it transcribed so that it's more legible. Separate accommodation is available for those young people who find it difficult to work in a big an environment where there are 100+ pupils sitting, or individual accommodation for those with extreme anxiety, or even something as simple as a calculator for somebody who has difficulties with numerous, who has been identified with dyscalculia. What I'd like to stress here is that the teacher needs to evidence that this is the normal way of working for that young person. So that young person has to show that in class, that is how they work in order for them to achieve their potential. And that young person needs to have access to practice these assessment arrangements before it comes to the exam. That's hugely important. And finally, I'm going to end up with this very little quote, which I think is just lovely. It's from Winnie the Pooh, but more importantly, it's from Piglet, Winnie the Pooh. And it says, the things that make me different are the things that make me me. That was a whistle stop.